Welcome to another podcast that I'm using this time to supplement our material for the Canterbury Tales. Now, we just finished the Beowulf unit. We're working now towards a test on Beowulf and a paper on Beowulf. But our next unit is the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, Chaucer. This is a really important piece because it represents the shift from the early Christian church to a much more developed social understanding of the Middle Ages. Now, the Middle Ages, just by its very definition, is an opportunity or a period of time when groups of people were trying to find out where they belonged. The church was trying to establish an order, and in a very general sense, we were trying to make sort of some sense out of the chaos that existed after the Dark Ages, that existed after major pieces like Beowulf or other cultural epics sort of stopped being the rule of the land, and we moved into more of an order of social organization. So I decided that this lecture is going to be mainly on the three estates. In class, we have gone over a couple of PowerPoints on the Middle Ages, on what Chaucer was intending with the Canterbury Tales. You'll have that content, but this is designed to supplement that information. So first of all, when a text is geared towards a certain class of people, it's called ad status, A-D-S-T-A-T-U-S, which is Latin for to the estate. So this concept of what we call the three estates, the three levels of organization in medieval society, comes from the Latin phrase ad status. So simply, it means that a work of literature is geared towards a specific group of people. Now, what exactly does this mean? It means that a book, a poem, is written for a specific class of people. So you're going to have a different writing for nobility than you will for your commoner. Remember, too, that in the Middle Ages, there weren't a whole lot of commoners that could read, so the text is going to be different than if it were towards the clergy, which were the educated, which were the readers, the writers, all of that material. We had talked with Beowulf about how the monks were those people that wrote it down. That's why there's so many Christian themes and so many Christian ideas in the material, is because it was the monks and the religious that did the writing. So I think it's important that we look at what we call these three estates. So the first estate, more simply, feudal society was traditionally divided into three estates, three equivalent social strata or social statuses. So this is important. Feudal society was typically divided. So if you remember from history, feudal society is that system where the king grants land to lords. Lords then sort of farm the land out to vassals. And you have various levels of servants, etc., etc., all the way down to the serfs. So the first estate was called the church. So the first estate is the church. It's primarily the clergy. This gets qualified as those who serve. So the first estate were those who served. So anytime you have your priests, your prioress, your monks, the nuns, priest, these are a variety of characters from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, but they're significant because they are considered to be the first estate. Now, within that first estate, you're going to have people of varying wealth. The monk, way down at the bottom, is going to have a different social presentation than, say, the prioress, the head nun, who is going to have a different presentation, is going to be given different characteristics. As we've done already this year, is you're looking at these personal characteristics and how they're developed to make sure that you understand where they come from. The second estate was the nobility. So even though they had the most money and even though they controlled society and made a lot of those decisions, the nobility weren't the first estate. It seems to be relatively simple. The second estate, or these nobility, were those who fought. So they were defined as the knights, those that were derived from the knights. It was common for aristocrats to enter the church and thus shift from the first estate to the second estate, but you couldn't go from the first estate down to the second. This idea of the three estates is significant because it prevents social mobility. This does tie specifically to what the universal chain of being, or the great chain of being, depending if you use the Shakespeare concept or the early church concept. The chain of being was the organization of the universe. So at the very top of the chain, the highest level is God. That next level down, and this is very similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but that second level down were the angels. Now, if you look at it this way, it's defined based upon the relative level of spirit versus the relative level of matter involved in each level. So at the very top, God, at the top of the chain of being, was all spirit. Angels were mainly spirit with a little bit of mortality, a little bit of man involved in their makeup. And you went down from that level. After the angels, you had human beings, which were all matter and a little bit of spirit. But below human beings were animals, and animals had more matter and less spirit than, say, humans did. Humans had more spirit and a smaller amount of matter. So what this allowed us to do is to look at the universe and say, okay, because I'm a human being and I have more spirit than the animals, therefore I have dominion over the animals. It's sort of a biblical concept. If you say that God put man on the earth to have dominion over the animals, that seems to make sense. Now, when you look at the next level down from those animals, is you had plants, because plants had much less movement, much less spirit than animals did. So therefore, they were given a lower status on the chain of being. At the very bottom of the chain, and I think this is a very significant concept, is inanimate matter, or, for example, rocks and stones. So things that had no matter. I'm sorry, things that had no ability to move on their own, no ability to do those kinds of things. I have an interesting light effect going on in here as I lean forward and backward, depending where my desk lamp is on. Kind of makes it fun. So, to sort of recap what this all means is that the more matter you had and the less spirit you had, the lower on the great chain of being you were. So that is important, I think, really in the grand scheme of things. In William Shakespeare's The Tragedy of Julius Caesar, he has one of the tribunes in Act 1, Scene 1, say to some of the commoners, "You blocks, you stones, you worse than senseless things." That's a direct insult that Shakespeare throws in that's based upon this concept of the chain of being. So that if you didn't have enough spirit, you didn't get ranked very high on this chain. The church was sort of ingenious in this sort of social organization, because what they then did is they took these ideas and they applied them to society. So at the very top of the chain is the king. At the very bottom of the chain, equivalent to rocks and stones, were the commoners. So this became a nice, neat way to organize the levels in feudal society. So if you moved up a little bit from the commoners, you had, I don't know, maybe a vassal or something along those lines, and they'd have a little bit more control than, say, a peasant would, but not nearly as much control as a wealthier noble or a wealthier member of the clergy. So what the Great Chain of Being does, or the Elizabethan Chain of Being, is it helps us to take these concepts and put an order to medieval society. This goes real well with the concepts of, this goes real well with the concept of these three estates, with the first estate being the clergy or those that prayed, the second estate being the nobility or those who fought, which is equivalent to knights, etc. And then the third estate are the commoners, or the peasantry. Everyone else, at least under feudalism, those that produced the food which supported those who prayed and those who fought, the members of the first and second estates. This is a really ingenious idea in the fact that it kept everybody in their appropriate place. Now, to be completely realistic, 80% of the population was in this third estate. You could move into the first estate if you became religious, which means usually the first son would go into the family, or in the family would go to the priesthood, etc., etc. Now, understand too that just like other things that we've looked at, this is a completely male-dominated perspective. So women were classified differently. Like men, medieval women were born into the third or the second estate, and might eventually become members of the first estate by entering the church. For women, it was willingly or not. If your family shipped you off to be a nun, kind of without your any kind of real input, because women didn't have power, you became part of the first estate, and that's just how it was. Women didn't have the opportunity. This becomes important when we look at the prioress and some of her decisions in the Canterbury Tales, when we look at the wife of Bath and decisions that she makes. So Chaucer's not really stupid when he comes through and he says, I need these characters. I need to look at how I'm going to present these individuals in this story so that I can do a couple of things. Number one, I can criticize the development of medieval society. I can criticize the feudal system. I can criticize the three estates. But I can do it in such a way that I'm not going to get in trouble with the man, with the king, with the church, whatever, so I don't get myself in deep trouble. I had said a moment ago that women were classified differently. Well, the women were specifically part of what were called the feminine estates. Feminine as in women. The feminine states were the idea of virgin, wife, and widow, as opposed to the clergyman, the knight, and the commoner. So the feminine estates were virgin, wife, and widow. That one seems interesting because the women's estates were not classified by profession, but instead by their sexual activity. Now, this isn't scandalous. It's just one of those comments that we make about the medieval world and the fact that women weren't really given any control, any power. So this creates sort of a built-in sexism that we are aware of, that we talk about, those kinds of things. So we have these feminine estates, virgin, wife, and widow. The virgin was very simply a reference to the Virgin Mary, so therefore it's your clergy, it's your nuns, it's your prioress, which is a head nun, and any other thing that kind of ties in with that. Wife is, well, you did your appropriate female role, you married, whether it was for wealth, whether it was for power or whatnot, and you assume a very specific position as a result of that marriage. And then widow, because women whose husbands died, which was not uncommon, the wife of Bath, for example, had 5 husbands. These things also become important. So the widow is given a certain social status as a result. Now, the Canterbury Tales is going to allow us a significant opportunity to look at these different levels of organization. The 3 estates, to examine the great chain of being and how that all fits together. So I think it's important in the grand scheme of things to take these notes on the 3 estates, on just briefly on the great chain of being, and to say, how do I make these apply to the text that I'm using in the class? There's a lot of material that I think we're going to need to cover in this small amount of time that we have. Now, granted, if I spend 5 weeks on the Canterbury Tales, that is very dense. I mean, the prologue itself takes me 2 weeks. Then we read 4 or 5 tales outside of it. We're going to be very, very busy, and there's some dense material here. So I think, very specifically, we want to be aware that Chaucer is very smart. He understands how to get everybody involved to do what he needs to do. When you read the Canterbury Tales, look for an idealized portrait of each of the traditional male estates. Which portraits are satirical? Note also the portraits representing 2 new groups that were gaining prominence in the 14th century, the middle class and the intellectuals. So we have idealized portraits of the traditional estates, the clergy, but we also pay attention in all of this to the middle class and a development of intellectuals, those people that spend their time going to school, not working in the fields with their hands, but going to school. So idealized portraits, their traditional 3 estates, the male presentations, the idea that they are in fact satirical. Note also the portraits representing the 2 new groups that were gaining prominence, the middle class, those that went out and produced wealth, and the intellectuals, people trained as clerks or clerics, those are the big terms, but who are non-destined. Not destined to a career with the church. They worked for the church, but they weren't absorbed completely by it like a priest or a nun would be. what pilgrims represent these new classes. So when you go through and you look at this whole band of travelers, I think there's somewhere between 25 and 30 on the journey total. Which ones do you want to be aware of? Pay attention to the pilgrim portraits. What does Chaucer give you about each specific individual? As you read the portraits, pick out a keyword or phrase that defines them. Now, this is significant because it takes me to the Canterbury Tales handout that I have posted on Moodle as a chart. It allows you to go through, and I list the character. I ask you which one of the 7 deadly sins does that character represent, and what notes jump out at you as being significant as you read that character. Now, we're a couple days away from actually getting into the meat of this, but still, I think this is a relevant bit of information. I've given you a lecture. I may do this in class. I may do it as another video lecture on the 4 humors. The balance of the 4 fluids in the body. Whether you're choleric, whether you're melancholy, whether you're phlegmatic, or whether you're sanguine. Each one of those characteristics refers to a specific type of character, and that specific type of character is going to get fleshed out. So an accompanying lecture to this information is going to be those 4 humors. I haven't yet decided if I'm going to do that in class and have you take notes, or use it as another one of these audio lectures or video lectures that you can use to supplement and then look as you go. Now, as I'm sitting here, I'm wearing my, what's over here? I forget it's reversed. My Dearborn Heights Montessori Cultural Program t-shirt. This is where my mother teaches. My kids go there. Huge opportunity. Now, seems to make sense. Now, what I would like you to do as sort of a supplement here is to look up what the significant symbolism for the square, the circle, and the triangle are in regards to personality types. In regards to personality types, circles, squares, and triangles, and be able to talk about what that might mean in regards to our learning styles, in regards to what type of people we are. It's an interesting concept, and I think when you look at a Montessori type education, it says a lot about what their general philosophy is. So to recap, and I'm at the 17-minute and 20-second mark right now. I've given you some notes on the 3 major estates and some general characteristics about each. I've talked about what character portraits are and what you want to look for as you're traveling through your notes. I mentioned the great chain of being with a relatively simplistic definition. I can always flesh that out more, but at least a starting point for you. So I've given you those notes. I've talked about why you need to know this, why it's important, and why this might be of value to you as you come into class later this week. So this is an assignment. Listen to this. Try and figure out what the circle, square, and triangle mean in regards to learning styles, communication styles, etc. If you can do that, I think you're going to be fine. So 18 minutes, 12 seconds, I'm going to end this podcast, and then we'll move on and continue to supplement the material.